All right, we're going to examine like what are the actual ingredients of a good public opinion poll, and there are generally like, three accepted criteria or ingredients that have to be met for you to have like a legitimate public opinion poll. The first is a no-brainer. It's just that you have to have like a fair question. It should be concise, like not overly wordy. It should be easily understood, and it should be non-biased, right? It should be easily understood. If the people don't understand like what they're even answering, but yet they're going to answer anyway, you're going to get like obviously flawed results. If the question is not neutrally presented and it's slanted one direction or the other, you're obviously going to get inaccurate like information. So here's an example of a polling question that's a pretty good question that I pulled from a survey back in the spring that dealt with sort of like COVID response. Is it the responsibility of the national or state governments to make sure that there are enough COVID-19 tests available in order to safely lift restrictions on public activity? So it's pretty easily understood. It's relatively concise. It's not really leading you to like one side or the other. So it's a pretty solid question. However, there are lots of questions that are used in polls that don't meet this criteria. For example, campaigns will sometimes actually use what are called push polls, and these are intentionally biased polls that are intended to sort of like alter the outcome of like the poll, or even have perhaps like bias you in how you like may vote or think about an issue. So here's a great example. This was a poll from a long time ago, from the 2000 primary election, that was used by the George W. Bush campaign, Governor Bush at the time, right? And he would eventually win the Republican nomination in 2000, and he would actually go on to win the presidency too. But this was a push poll that was used by the Bush campaign in the Republican primary against one of the other Republicans, John McCain, that was running for president back in 2000. And this was a push poll that was conducted in South Carolina. So the question that was asked of people by the Bush campaign was, John McCain calls the campaign finance system corrupt. But as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, he raises money and travels on the private jets of corporations with legislative proposals before his committee. In view of this, are you much more likely to vote for him, somewhat more likely to vote for him, somewhat more likely to vote against him, or much more likely to vote against him? This is obviously not a non-biased poll, and it was designed intentionally to be biased by the Bush campaign, trying to sort of like persuade voters, obviously not to vote for McCain, because here's someone that has talked about the influence of money in politics and how it should be like curtailed, and yet the Bush campaign is working in the poll that he's taking trips on private jets and things like that. You're working in this information to try and make people feel a certain way. Obviously, this is an example of a push poll. You're trying to push people to obviously voting away from McCain and probably for someone like Bush. You also need a group of people to ask the question of. So you need a sample population. Clearly, the way polls work is that when you're conducting a poll of who are Pennsylvanians going to vote for in the 2020 election, you can't ask every Pennsylvanian. So you have to come up with like a sample of that larger population, which are all the potential voters in Pennsylvania. So there are two elements to a population sample that have to be met for you to have a legitimate poll. The first is the sample has to be random. So what does that mean? It means that like everybody that is taking the survey or the poll, participating in the poll, essentially has the same chance of being selected as everybody else. So you're not just asking like friends or family or things like that. But, like everybody that is asked to participate in the poll theoretically has the same chance mathematically of being selected. Also, the poll should be like representative of like the larger population. So obviously, if you are only going to ask like Republicans on who you're going to vote for, you can't then project that's how all Pennsylvanians are going to vote, right? You try to make sure that the demographic that you're actually sampling is representative of the demographics of like the larger population whose views you're looking to like measure. And then the other thing that's important for you to always sort of look at when you're reading about polls or you're seeing polls is sort of like the reported margin of error. So the margin of error is simply describing sort of like sort of the range of the accuracy of that survey. So if you look here, right at the bottom of this is from the 2016 Republican primary, where you see like all of the candidates who were asked, like Republicans, like who do you support winning the nomination to be the Republican candidate in the 2016 election? Ted Cruz at 28%, Trump at 26%, so on and so forth. But it says like a plus or minus margin of error of like almost 5%. What does this mean? It means that the accurate number for each of these percentages could be for each of them 5 points higher or 5 points like lower. So clearly that like makes a big difference with some of these outcomes, right? So it's sort of like the range of like how confident you are about this. So obviously for Cruz, you're talking about it could be as high as 33% or as low as 23%. But obviously, if you do the same thing for Trump, you're now saying that you're not exactly sure how accurate this survey is. A really good survey generally will have a margin of error at 3% or less. So this one's pretty high at 5%. So you might say, okay, I'm not going to put a whole lot of stock into what these survey results are saying because the mathematical calculations show that there is a margin of error of like greater than 3%. So it's something to keep your eye on when you're looking at survey results.